Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. The United States Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, is currently threatening Russia with the implementation of serious new measures from both the United States and its allies should the war in Ukraine fail to conclude in the very near future. As New York Times journalists have learned, the Pentagon is already preparing. Tomahawk missiles are being prepared for potential transfer to Ukraine if such an order were to be given by the President of the United States, Donald Trump. The harsh rhetoric from the American Secretary of Defense is a clear reflection of the American president's desire, after successfully resolving the conflict in the Middle East, to move towards ending another protracted conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war. And in a situation where Russian President Putin completely disregards any appeals from his American counterpart for genuine peace negotiations and a ceasefire on the Russia-Ukraine war front, Trump is attempting to exert pressure on Russia, much as he recently did with Hamas. However, it's quite evident that mere words alone are simply not enough to exert sufficient pressure on the Kremlin. For now, Trump has opted for an escalation of words, apparently convinced that merely threatening to supply Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, a move that could entail substantial logistical challenges if executed, will compel Putin to seriously consider genuine peace negotiations with Ukraine regarding the cessation of hostilities. The United States Secretary of Defense also states the necessity of moving beyond mere words and transitioning to tangible, concrete actions. Pete Hegseth is calling on allies to move beyond mere rhetoric and take decisive action, urging them to boost their procurement of American weapons for Ukraine. Meanwhile, it is evident that the Trump administration isn't even contemplating the necessity of supplying Ukraine with fresh aid packages from the United States, unlike the approach taken during President Joseph Biden's tenure. Furthermore, the financial resources that European nations might expend on acquiring American armaments are clearly inadequate to incite any serious apprehension in Moscow concerning the ongoing continuation of military operations in the coming years. Of course, the situation could be altered if Donald Trump were to make a decisive move to significantly enhance the supply of American weaponry. This would represent a qualitative shift in support. This means we are discussing long-range missiles, such as the Tomahawk, and the authorization for Ukraine to employ these missiles for targeting strikes on the sovereign territory of the Russian Federation. This would be for the purpose of eliminating Russia's strategic military and energy facilities. Furthermore, it is thought that Donald Trump's decision to grant Ukraine this authorization might influence the perspectives of the United States' European allies as well. Then, even if Ukraine were to receive a merely symbolic quantity of Tomahawk missiles, and even if it remains unclear how they would be launched, European countries could provide Ukraine with a significantly greater number of long-range missiles, and without the usual logistical problems that are commonly connected with the provision of Tomahawk missiles. And then Russia would truly be in a difficult situation. In this situation, the Russia-Ukraine war could potentially develop into realistic directions. Firstly, the Russian president might genuinely fear that new weaponry available to Ukraine could alter the situation both at the front and in the rear, causing him to hold back from striking Ukrainian infrastructure and agree to realistic negotiations for a ceasefire on the Russia-Ukraine front. Realistic negotiations for a ceasefire on the Russia-Ukraine front line. In that case, the Russia-Ukraine war would face a fate similar to the Middle East conflict. Putin would likely pause during Donald Trump's time in the White House to meticulously prepare for a new phase of the Russia-Ukraine war. This next stage could commence as early as 2029 under a different American administration, at which point Putin would no longer be apprehensive about the unpredictability of a new president of the United States, although it is still unknown who that new president will be. Political processes in the United States are developing at such a rapid pace that Donald Trump's successor could turn out to be even more unpredictable and chaotic than the current US president. However, the military situation could also develop in a different direction. Putin will endeavor to demonstrate that long-range missiles and strikes targeting the sovereign territory of the Russian Federation will not compel him to abandon his objectives. Instead, he will pursue further escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war and broaden the conflict's scope to encompass the territory of NATO member countries. And in this situation, the hybrid warfare that we are already observing between the Russian Federation and NATO member countries, with the appearance of drone armies in the airspace of European countries, as well as Russian fighters that we recently saw in the airspace of, say, Estonia, could turn into a genuine conflict. This might involve Russian military forces or aircraft encroaching upon NATO airspace with the goal of neutralizing those military installations from which, in the view of the Russian Federation, assistance is being extended to Ukraine in the subsequent rounds of the Russia-Ukraine confrontation. And in this way, the situation could escalate to a direct confrontation between Russia and the NATO member countries. Moreover, in such a scenario, the United States, led by Donald Trump, would find it exceedingly difficult to avoid a war in Europe. This is precisely because American assets could become the prime targets for the Russian president, who would then believe he could coerce the American to refrain from providing further assistance to Ukraine and intervening in European affairs. We do not yet know the specific direction the situation will take at the present moment. The possibilities for de-escalation over the next few months are precisely as high as the prospects for a significantly greater escalation of the conflict, potentially transforming it into a third world war, even involving mutual nuclear exchanges between the two nuclear superpowers. We must remember that for Putin and his inner circle, nuclear weapons have long ceased to be merely a weapon of deterrence and have transformed into an outright weapon of blackmail. This doesn't preclude its use at a moment the Russian leadership considers critical in their confrontation with Ukraine and the West. But let's hope that the leadership of the Russian Federation has more common sense than willingness to destroy humanity. And if Ukraine does receive modern weaponry, it won't lead to a nuclear strike on American facilities in Europe, but rather to negotiations for a suspension or even a ceasefire in the Russia-Ukraine war in the coming years. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe, and follow my social media, Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatella, which help these resources grow. Use YouTube's sponsorship feature. I wish you victory and peace. Good luck.